Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation tonight by Wally Shaw, which is called The Bees Know What They're Doing, but Does the Beekeeper? I have to say my conscience is pricked every time I read that title. Wally and his wife Jenny have been keeping bees together for 30 years and now have 50 colonies of bees. They started from modest beginnings with one and the only colony that they paid money for. And as their fascination with honeybees grew, so did the number of colonies. Wally's most recent book is called Swarming, Biology and Control, and is available from Beecraft. Wally has previously published 6 pamphlets on beekeeping, from swarm control via comb management to feeding bees, and his beekeeping expertise is greatly appreciated by many. Wally and Jenny enjoy the benefits of living on the island of Anglesey, which means they have more control over their breeding programs than is possible in other parts of the country. Both Jenny and Wally are ex-research ecologists, and so the skills they learned in their professional careers complemented naturally with their fascination with honeybees. As I've said on previous occasions, the access to high-quality speakers like Wally has been made possible by the rapid adoption of new technologies like Zoom. And so we're immensely privileged to be able to listen to Wally from North Wales and to learn from his expertise that many of us can only hope to aspire to. And now if I just touch on the meeting protocols, Kathy will switch you all to mute during the presentation. However, Wally will welcome questions to be held until the end. So during the presentation, please could you submit questions via your chat button on the bottom of your screens for discussion at the end. Sorry, but this method appears to be the best to avoid people talking over each other with a slight delay from Zoom connections. So welcome, Wally, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will put my display up and then I'll have share screen. I think that's all I have to do. Where are we now? Can't see which one. Oh, yeah. Right, that should be okay. Oh, no, I needed to share screen. Are you seeing me or not? Are you seeing my screen or not?
Yes, I just see you, Wally.
Can you see the presentation or not?
No.
Okay, hold on a minute then. Okay. I think I know what to do.
Good job, somebody does.
Okay, share screen, yes, right, okay. I just need to get the presentation. Okie doke. I've got the presentation here, yes, okie doke. Okay.
Not yet.
Don't you have the presentation? Oh. Jen. Why haven't I got the presentation? Why can't I? Why is it not coming up on their screens? I said share.
Host disabled participant. Right, the host has disabled you, so the host needs to enable you.
The problem is you need to enable me. My screen sharing is disabled. So whoever's in control, it's not my fault for once.
Try now, Wally.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to share now. Right. Okay. I can go there now, can't I?
I think you've done too early.
Hold on a minute. No,
Okay, right.
which is this presentation? Which is the presentation? I haven't got the presentation up
Tell me
now.
where you are now.
No, you've done the presentation in some way. It was in the background before.
You find it then.
Hmm?
They don't know what they're doing.
We're actually sharing your screen.
Hold on. There we go. Right. Getting it now?
No, sorry.
Still not got it, Jen.
Yeah, well, you've not shared your screen.
I did. I said share it.
Right, so I need to end the show. I have to go back in again. So
I can get rid of that.
Yeah. Get rid of that. So here, share.
Yeah. Okay.
You didn't hit that.
Okay.
Now you can do it.
Now,
Right. I'll be there. I'm coming. I'm getting there. I haven't got the screens now, Jen.
We've got your Zoom screen in front of your slide. I think we can see your screensaver screen.
Right. Okay.
Now we've got your screensaver screen. Now there we are. Now you just want to go to full screen.
Yeah, I'll get the full screen now. Yes, that's okay. Right. We okay?
Yep, perfect.
yes.
I've got it's out the way over there. Yeah. Okie doke. Sorry about that. Right. Okay. You've asked for a slightly odd talk, but it was your choice. So you've only got yourself to blame if you don't like it. So the title is deliberately provocative, of suggesting that the beekeepers don't know what they're doing, and that isn't the aim of it at all. And these two cartoons just sort of represent it. My daughter draws these cartoons for me, and this is based on the idea that you often hear beekeepers say, these bees don't seem to read the same beekeeping book as me. And what you have to remember is that the bees didn't write the books. But this is the problem in a nutshell. Beekeepers often do not properly understand what the bees are doing. And this is just a cartoon choice of reading materials. The beekeepers reading basic beekeeping and the bees reading astrophysics, right? Okay, so I'm not going to tell you how to keep bees. This talk is designed to encourage you to look at beekeeping in a slightly different perspective. And it's what I call apicentric. It's not the way beekeeping is usually presented in beekeeping books. But early on in our beekeeping, somebody gave me a copy of Jim Wadey's book, The Bee Craftsman. Jim Wadey was the editor of Beecraft for coming up 30 years. It may have been over 30 years. And he wrote this book while on fire duty in the Second World War. And it was published right at the end of the war when paper became available. And when I read this book before we'd really done any beekeeping, and I found it interesting, but not that very helpful. And it wasn't until I'd done some beekeeping, I fully understood what Wadey was on about. And he's basically on about the same sort of thing, that your relationship with a colony of bees should be based on your understanding of what they're doing. And the recent publication by Tom Seeley, Lives of Bees, follows very much along this line. I don't know how many beginners you've got there. They may not understand some of the details that I'm going to talk about tonight, but in time they will. And it's the way of thinking that matters. And by the way, I'm not talking natural beekeeping, although there will be references to it. Right, the talk's in 4 parts. I'm going to first of all talk about honeybee colony in the wild and its lifestyle. And secondly, and this is the most important part, Polly, it's the interface between the colony and the beekeeper. So how what we do in beekeeping affects the colony. And there's a little bit on bee health, and finally, a very short piece on threats to honeybees. So this is part one, honeybee colonist lifestyle. The movable frame modular hive invented by Langstroth marked the beginning of beekeeping proper. Before that, people just kept bees in some sort of container where they just did their own thing as they would in the wild. And initially, there was really very little knowledge about the biology and ecology of honeybees. And beekeeping developed by observation and trial and error. And a lot of the things we do today were invented a long time ago, and some of them are still good. There's nothing wrong with them. Other ones are not quite so good. And we often do things without understanding the basis of the management or understanding what has happened when it goes wrong. One of the things that certainly wasn't understood early on was that the queen underwent multiple mating and the importance that had for the colony. I haven't been able to find an exact date when that was discovered, but I mean, over the time I've been beekeeping, the number of matings that a queen is thought to make has steadily been increasing as the science of this sort of thing has advanced. Another thing was something that I've always been interested with swarming was for 60 years, the theory of swarming was based on what was called the Gerstung theory. And this theory, apparently very logically, claimed that colonies set up to swarm when there was an excess of brood food compared with the number of larvae to be fed, and that this brood food sort of overflowed into starting the swarming. And this, I say, held sway for about 60 years and was finally disproved by some work by John Simpson at Rothampstead in the 50s sometime. And there are quite a few things we still don't understand about bees today. So understanding the honeybee, we tend to be very anthropomorphic about how we think about bees. And anthropomorphic is the adjective, and it means we attribute human form or personality to them. And the colony does exhibit complex behavior, so we tend to assume they must be a bit like us, but they're not. And we often have a confusion of terms with the words that we use with beekeeping. For example, a colony without a queen is described often as being demoralized, whatever that means. And the word stressed is often used in this context without people really understanding what stress means. It's not stressed in the way that we think of neurological stress. It's stressed, stress means it's physiologically stressed, either by not having enough food or having disease. Those are all stresses, but they're not like the stresses as we think of them as humans. Now the question is, are bees intelligent? And well, yes, with apologies to Star Trek, but not as we know it. Intelligence is probably not applicable to the individual bee, but to the colony, yes, it is. And the idea of the super organism has been around for quite a while now. And the colony does have intelligence, but it only has intelligence dealing with problems that it's actually programmed to solve. Beekeeping colonies cannot solve novel problems. And Jim Wadey summed this up all those years ago in that in his writings he kept on referring to the hive mind, and that's what that wasn't understood at that time, but that was his idea, which is equivalent to colony intelligence. And a lot more about that, of course, in Seeley's Honeybee Democracy, the way that the colony intelligence is used to choose the best nest site available for the swarm to go to, and how they come to a consensus of opinion about it and then head off to it. So the behavior is determined both by instincts at an individual level and a colony level. And instinctive behavior is a sort of series of programs, if you like, and in computer terminology, that's hardwired. In fact, they're neurologically wired. Some programs operate all the time. They're sort of default programs, if you like. And the feeding of brood in the colony is automatic. It just goes on, and it's not organized in any way. Feeding the brood works by worker bees wandering about more or less aimlessly, not under any particular pattern. But when they come across, their job is feeding brood. When they come across brood that needs feeding, they feed it. And they have information because the type of food that the larva wants is determined by the pheromones that's emitted by the larva. Other programs involve more than one bee. For example, swarming. There would appear to be a group of bees in a colony who control the swarming process. Whether they control it right from the start to the beginning is not clear. And of course, their control and their identity only becomes apparent at the time when the colony actually swarms. And they are the bees that actually promote the act of swarming and then initiate the scouting for a new home. And those bees are definitely just one group amongst the flying bees. And one of the basic programs is the age-related task schedule for a worker bee, what's called temporal cast ontogeny. But of course, this is highly flexible, and nurse bees, for example, can go on feeding for several weeks, or if the labour market is different, the demands are different, they can give that up and do other jobs prematurely. It's not fixed, absolutely, but they go through a series of morphological and physiological changes that fit them for the task at hand. There are limitations to the honeybee's instinctive behavior, and it's still a wild animal. So its instincts are really its evolutionary toolkit. And it enables them to fulfill their life strategy. And it's developed over by natural selection, perhaps over 30 million years or something like that. But all these instincts are designed to deal with only natural situations, and they're not designed to deal with beekeepers who can create situations that do not occur in nature. And this is where most of the misunderstanding starts. A colony gives the impression of highly cooperative function. And this is correct, but it's not in a human way at all. There's no hierarchy in a hive. Each worker does her own independent thing most of the time, and people who think the queen in charge, she's probably less in charge than anybody else in the colony. She's entirely controlled by the workers. And apparently cooperative activities are actually often the result of individual responses of bees. So when the colony needs air conditioning, bees start to fan, and they do it because they individually find that the environment within the hive is not to their liking, so they start fanning to improve it. Now, this is one of the things that's well understood. If you have a colony that where the queen has mated very narrowly, and there are only perhaps a couple of families of bees in the hive, they will all tend to respond to this to the conditions in the hive simultaneously, and therefore the conditions in the hive will oscillate wildly as they all come on to fan at the same time and all stop fanning at the same time. But when there's genetic diversity in the colony, different bees have different thresholds at which they respond to the environment, so the fanning becomes very smoothed out and keeps the conditions very level. Comb building is another example of an individual response. For honeycomb, that will be drawn when a foraging bee comes in. It hands over its nectar to what's called a receiver bee, and when that receiver bee has got a load on board, it goes off into the hive to find somewhere to deposit it. If it takes over a certain time, and the time has never been determined, but it's quite a short time, it's probably a matter of only minutes. If it cannot find anywhere to deposit this nectar, either because the cell is already full or because there are other bees working on the cell, it will then ingest that nectar that it's been given, and that will switch it on to comb building. And this will go on, the comb building will go on as long as this bee will remain as a wax producer as long as it can go down to the entrance of the hive and load up there from an incoming bee. They don't use already stored nectar to fuel the wax production. So it's automatically controlled by the amount of forage that is coming in, which is what you want, because of course wax is an expensive commodity for them to make. Other functions do involve groups of bees, but even then they tend to work independently on this. And as I've already said, swarming does involve a group of bees, but the large part of a colony that is set up to swarm have no idea what's going to happen. They are just carrying on their day job as normal, whereas these other bees are working in the background, organizing it. And so, oops, sorry. Honeybees get most of the information they need directly from conditions in the hive. And because they're individuals, they're in computer technology, they're rather like parallel processors. And these are sort of computers that do climate predictions. And they're all computing separately, but they have a central storage of information, which is the hive itself. Other information is passed from bee to bee within the hive, such as the pheromones to indicate the presence of the queen. Prophylaxis is always going on in hives, and really we have very little idea what is happening here. It might be quite a lot of different things, but it's obviously very important. But clearly there also has to be an information flow between the inside and the outside of the hive. Inside the hive, they're the bees that know what resources they need in terms of nectar, pollen, water, or propolis. And they have to pass this information on to the bees that can get it for them. Similarly, the bees outside know the state of foraging conditions and control inside the hive how many foragers they recruit. And they actually have the ability to lay off foragers if there isn't anything really going for them. So it's all very well controlled. So the honeybee's senses, they're very different from ours. They have compound eyes, but of course they spend most of their life in the dark. And the question is, do they have a real-time image of the world like we do? And I think of course, that requires an incredible amount of neurological processing. They probably don't. We often don't realize we actually have a real-time image of the world. And this is the, without having a picture, we are able to do things. And this is particularly obvious in things like somebody fast bowling in cricket or tennis or something like that. It is not the real-time image that allows the person to hit the ball correctly. It is a much more primitive part of the brain which is able to do this without having a visual picture, because it all happens too fast. Our visual picture of the world is about 1/10 of a second behind what's really happening. So when we're driving a car, we tend to see something happening and we've actually done something about it before we got a real-time image. Bees have no hearing, although they're very sensitive to vibrations. And we have to remember that the various dances that they use are not seen in the hive, they are felt. And then the tremendous amount of information in the hive goes by chemical information, and their antennae are rich in sensors. There are currently about 50 pheromones identified, both releases and primers, and we don't understand what they all do, but the bees certainly do. So the master plan for a bee economy, its aim in life. The colony does not share the beekeeper's aims, which is produce a lot of honey. Like all living organisms, its main aim, its only aim, if you like, is reproduction, and everything else that it does is subservient to that objective. Successfully passing your genes on into the future is what it's all about, and all the complex behavior of a bee colony is a means to an end, and that end only. So the annual cycle of colony and its timing is aimed to give it the best chance of reproducing successfully. Surely reproduction is not that difficult, so why all the complexity? Well, in evolutionary terms, the honeybee has survived a very long time, and as a single species, okay, in several different races, but a single species, it's adapted to live in a wide range of climatic regimes. It can exist in near desert conditions, in wet rainforest, in subtropical climates, and quite far north into the temperate climate. Perhaps only man is as flexible as this about where the species can live. And like man, the honeybee, of course, creates its own nest environment. And this is part of the secret of its success. So the way they do it, who are we to question how they do it? They do it very successfully. There was a recent book called The Dark Side of the Hive, written by a couple of bee biologists, which looked into all the possible maladaptations of honeybees. And it was very interesting, but it was a rather silly concept, because in evolution, a species starts out with a toolkit of things that it does, and it has to develop that toolkit. You can't go right back to the beginning and say, well, okay, how would this best be done? You can't redesign it from scratch. When I went to Bangor University, we had a zoology lecturer who said some rather forthright things. And at that time, there were quite a lot of people with very religious backgrounds on the courses, and one of his comments one day was, he was talking about the human knee and its poor adaptation for what it does. He's saying, if I'd been on God's design committee, I'd done it completely different. And that just doesn't happen that way. They have to make do with the genes they've got, and slowly through mutations, change what they do, but they can't start from scratch. By contrast, the beekeeper's aims are to produce a large colony as possible and maintain it for as long as possible during the season. And that colony may be 2 to 3 times, maybe more, the natural size that the colony would produce. And we, the beekeepers, to prevent or delay the initiation of swarming, manipulate the space that is available to them. And if the colony attempts to swarm, we impose swarm control, artificial swarming on them. And what we're doing is we're actually permitting reproduction, but we're only on our terms, and the self-interest of the beekeeper in all this is paramount. So does this matter, and what aspects of it do matter to the bees? So, right, part 2, now we're coming to, that leads into the interface between the colony and the beekeeper. So, I mean, I'm going to examine how putting bees in a hive and subjecting them to management affects them. How flexible can the bees be in response to what the beekeeper does? And what compromises should we make to accommodate the needs of the bees? How can we best keep healthy, happy bees? Now there you see, I've just deliberately used a favorite anthropomorphism. I don't think there's such a state in a bee that it's actually happy, has an emotion in that sort of way, but it's a short, it's a sort of a shortcut we use to explain things. So there are 4 possible responses of a colony to what the beekeeper does to it. And the first of these, it takes little notice. So I think when you add a super to a colony during the season, it's not really obvious to the colony, and it doesn't change what it's doing. It just gives it more space to put food. The colony may also just follow its natural instinct, and we manipulate the brood area to simulate immaturity. So when we're constantly giving space for the queen to lay, we are saying to the bees, you're not quite ready yet to swarm. You haven't laid everywhere that's possible. And this is used to prevent or delay swarming. So we're tapping on their natural instincts. The colony can be confused and the outcome is unpredictable. And this is the case when we come to artificial swarming. However you do it, it is an unnatural thing you're doing to them. And the trick is to give them something that they understand so that they can actually decide on what response to make to artificial swarming. And the other final response is you actually manage to con the bees. And the biggest con of all is introducing a new unrelated queen to a colony. And this is nothing more than putting the last nail in their coffin, really, because in a few weeks' time, the bees that in that, well, for the next few weeks, those bees will be slaves to a queen who is not related to them. And in a few weeks, they will be overtaken by that queen's offspring, and their genetic line will die out. So it's a total failure as far as they're concerned. It's a success as far as the beekeeper's concerned, but as far as the bees are concerned, it's a failure. So the starting point is to look at how bees live in the wild. And how does this compare with living in a hive? The hive is different, but does this matter? I've got a few pictures now just showing some some colonies in the wild. This is a tree a few miles away from us on somebody else's land, and it had had a colony in this tree claimed for a number of years. Whether they were there continuously or not, we don't know. And this is what happened to it next year. We had a gale in June, and the tree split open like this.
What's that?
Exposing the length of the nest. And I've been up there and had a look at it. This is a ladder. This is about sort of 3 meters up the tree, and the length of this nest is about nearly 2 meters. It's a tall, narrow nest, and the entrance hole was around here, where I've got the cursor now, right? So that's one nest. This is another one we came across. There's a company who sold firewood, and they said, we've just cut down a tree and it had a bee's nest in it, and we brought it back to our yard. Would you like to have it? And they'd actually cut through the top of the nest, and they'd nailed a piece of wood on top to keep the bees in. And we had this on our lawn for a week or so, and the bees appeared to be flying, but then it gradually petered out. And when we cut it open with a chainsaw, the comb inside was completely higgledy-piggledy. It had been thrown onto a lorry and tipped off, and the whole thing was smashed, and the colony didn't survive. But that's a much shorter cavity than living in here. This is one we took out of the roof of a large house, where the whole of this pediment here was filled with comb, and only this area down here was actually being used, but there was other comb out here. And this had been in occupation for some years, whether continuously or not, we never, no way to tell. They don't always have to have an entrance at the bottom. This is one where they've actually got an entrance at the top of the cavity, and this is a shed with a cavity wall that is just thick enough to allow two combs. And it's about the entire colony. This is about a square meter here, and in most areas there are just 2 levels of comb. And we got this out safely with a little bit of difficulty. And there's another one we had. So they have another. This is the local water board had a depot, and they, in the yard, they had this cable drum they wanted to get rid of because you've got a colony of bees inside. And so they just, the point of all this is that bees are expert at adapting to whatever nest site they can find, and they will do the best they can with it. Some nest sites may not be suitable for long-term survival occupation. They're too small, too cold, or they're not defendable. But most designs of beehive probably provide a superior nest site. So we're not, when we put bees in a beehive, we're not really doing the dirty on them. We're giving them the best accommodation, probably. So we might consider, what are the bees actually looking for? And again, this is based on some of Tom Seeley's work. And the bee goes out, the scout bees go out with a checklist of things that they want to find about the cavity they're going to occupy. And these are the main things, the checklist for an ideal home, if you like. The cavity wants to be about 40 litres in capacity. That is their top choice. And it wants to have a single small entrance of about 10 square centimetres, very small really. And remarkably, they are able to assess the volume of a cavity. They actually have a behaviour pattern which consists of walking in 2 dimensions and then flying in the 3rd dimension, which is across it. And knowing how quickly they bump into the other side enables, sort of pacing out the ones they can pace out and then flying across enables them to assess the volume very accurately. There's another preference for nest site, which is a height of 6 to 8 meters from the ground, which is not very helpful for beekeepers, really. All the useful information, but all this is useful information for setting up a bait hive. These are the things that attract bees. There are a few other things they like. They prefer south facing. They prefer the entrance to be at the bottom of the cavity, not like the one we showed in the shed wall, which was at the top. They're always attracted by previous occupation. So the remains of some combs and the smell thereof is good. The shape of the cavity and whether it is drafty or not, or wet or dry, doesn't seem to matter. They're able to adjust some of these things using propolis. It's the size of the cavity and the entrance that the scout bees look at really carefully. It's also important to remember that swarms prefer to move away from their original home, and estimates put this distance anything between 50 and 400 meters. So their instinct is disperse, and we'll come back to that issue in a minute. So how does these sizes equate with what the beekeeper is offering? Well, a modified national deep box, it has a capacity of about 30 litres and a shallow about 23 litres. The extra deep 12 by 14 box is 48 litres. You can do sums based on this now. So, for example, in summer, we would have a colony. We usually keep colonies on brood and a half. So that's 58 litres to start off. And if you put 4 supers on it, that gives you a total capacity of 150 litres, which is, well, it's over 4 times what the bees would naturally think of as a home. That's how much we are moving the goalposts for them. Hive entrances, I don't know whether any of you are still using the traditional solid floors with an entrance block, but when the entrance block isn't in summer, that gives an entrance side of about 90 square centimeters, which is roughly 10 times what their choice would be. So when you put a bait hive, you need to put a bait hive out, you want a small entrance. Open mesh floors are similar, but do you ever need to remove the entrance block with an open mesh floor? Because the reason that you are having a solid floor open is for good ventilation. But with a mesh floor, you get good ventilation through the mesh. And by the way, we only ever have a catch tray in our mesh floors if we want to count the fall of mites. We don't have it in any other time of the year. With a small entrance, you may think that there'll be congestion at the hive entrance, but having a small entrance also reduces the colony's need to have guards on duty. So this shows the sort of floors we have. Here is our main entrance size, which is 8 millimeters high and 100 millimeters wide. And this serves the colony perfectly well for the whole of the year. And it doesn't need a mouse guard or anything like that. For small colonies, we also have a smaller entrance block, which is only 40 millimeters wide. And on occasions, we have started off a colony being small with this entrance and forgotten to change it. And it's absolutely remarkable how the following year, the bees managed perfectly well with an entrance as small as this. There is rarely any congestion at the hive entrance or bearding at the front of the hive. Because there's good ventilation there, there aren't bees coming out for a breather and things like that. And the bees come and go without any sort of congestion. There are other important differences between a natural nest and a hive. And the most important of this, with the tree anyway, the inside of the tree is rough. And the first thing the bees do when they occupy this nest is remove any friable material, and then they proceed to coat it with propolis, which can be a layer up to about 2 millimeters thick. But the inside of our hives is smooth and doesn't attract the deposition of propolis. So does this complete envelope of propolis in a natural nest contribute to bee health? Well, if you want to find out about this, you need to Google the work of Marla Spivak at Minnesota University. If you just on your computer, just Google Marla Spivak propolis, you'll get a whole series of articles about propolis. And this is something we're thinking about doing, and in the next, hopefully in the coming season, we will have a trial of something which attracts without messing with the hive too much. We're going to use dummy boards that attract the deposition of propolis, have a very rough surface, and we'll see how that works out. Natural comb spacing, that's been known about for a very long time. The famous bee scientist Francois Huber discovered in 1808 and published about it, but it's rarely understood by beekeepers. When a colony builds its nest in a colony, it builds those combs at 29 to 32 millimeter centers. And these are multi-purpose. They don't distinguish between combs they're going to store honey in and stone and combs they are going to raise brood in. And this precise spacing has a very good reason. And although to you and I, the odd millimeter doesn't sound much, but for the bees, it's quite a large distance, quite a large difference in size. So what comb spacing is actually determined by the depths of worker brood cells that are ready for the queen to lay. And regardless of what depth they may have been, so when you've had honey stored in the brood area over winter, all those cells will be much deeper than are required for the queen to lay in them. So the bees will trim those down until their depth is almost precisely 2.05 times the diameter of the cell. This is very, very precise. So if you've got narrow cells in the colony, they will be trimmed down much shallower than the wider ones. So what are the advantages of this spacing? And the narrowest we can go in our hives with the equipment that's provided in this country is 35 millimeters. That's what Hoffman frames are. The black Hoffman spacer has got an extra. It's 34.5 millimeters actually, and you could argue it was slightly better. I'm not sure it's significant. And this spacing is really all about thermoregulation of the brood area. So if you have the correct spacing, more brood is possible for a given number of bees. So that if you have this spacing of 35 millimeters, as opposed to the old narrow spacers, by the way, which the old narrow spacers gave a spacing of 36.5 millimeters, which is significantly wider. Some people have claimed that narrow spacing of frames is an inducement to swarm, but personally, I think this is a bogus. It's because the colony is larger earlier with closer spacing. Here's a picture showing what 35 millimeter spacing means, and what the bees are going to want to have is they want to have the gap between when these have been adjusted to the correct depth, they want the gap between to be just enough to allow worker bees to tend both sides of the gap without interfering with one another, and that's when they're patrolling and feeding larvae. But when it's cold, this space can be very tightly packed with just 2 layers of bees, which makes it very efficient. The amount of drone comb in a natural nest is known to be about 17% of the cells. With little variation, they have a very clear idea about how much drones they want. And this is more than most beekeepers like to see. Is this important? Having plenty of drone comb increases the drones available for mating, but on the downside, more drone brood enables verb populations to increase faster. And I know plenty of beekeepers who regard drones as being freeloaders, who are just a drain on the colony's economy and reduce the honey yield. However, it has been suggested by several people, and there's actually been a bit of work on it in Europe, that the presence of drones actually does cause the foraging to be more active, in the same way that the presence of a queen encourages foraging and the presence of brood encourages foraging. So apparently does the presence of drone and drone brood. So don't look on your drones as just eating up your honey. They have several purposes. Of course, we force the bees to make very different combs when they make in a natural nest. We force them to build flat combs in wooden frames. And these, of course, are not particularly good sounding boards. And I think this is why bees will chew away the comb at the bottom and up the side bars very often as well. And they will do this just to the combs that are in the center of the brood box at the bottom of the hive. And this is where the foraging dances occur. And if you remember what we said about sorry, I've lost it. This is where the foraging dances occur, and this is where, by not coincidentally, they do this chewing back to have the comb more free hanging so that it can conduct vibrations. And we also use wired foundation as well, which is not fragile, can retain for years. And the use of plastic foundation, of course, is even worse. The comb is almost eternal if you want it to be, but it's a bad news. Combs in wild nests are usually quite short-lived. They're often eaten down by wax moth, or the colony moves on to fresh comb. It likes to move on to fresh comb. Most, as I've said, the combs are multi-purpose, but we do restrict this by the use of queen excluder, and we'll discuss the queen excluder in a minute. Natural cell size, natural comb produced by the types of bee we have here is they build comb that which the cells have a diameter of between 5.2 and 5.4 millimeters, but it's quite variable. And those of you who have measured the foundation that we get sold, most of it is about 5.6 millimeters, which is bigger than the bees make naturally, right? And unbeknown to most people, to make comb with a bigger cell size is a historical decision that was made right at the beginning of the production of foundation. And there was a gentleman in Belgium who did some research on cell size and discovered that you could increase the cell size that the bees would produce bees in, and that the larger cells would produce larger bees. And the theory here was that larger bees could carry a bigger payload and can forage under colder conditions. And this was the thinking behind the size of foundation that gets milled. And we still do this today. We still make foundation, which is a slightly bigger cell size than they would naturally. The interesting thing, nobody's ever done the research to discover whether producing larger bees does have any effect on the honey production of the colony. And those of you who have been around a bit will realize that about 10 years ago, there was a big thing about small cell beekeeping. And it was claimed to have all sorts of benefits, but the evidence was largely anecdotal. For example, it was claimed that it controlled American foul brood. But if you think about it, the actual regression process by which you convert bees from large cells to small cells, it usually can't occur in one step, because the bees themselves have to get smaller to work on smaller cells. So regression usually takes place in 2 stages, so that they have to build a new set of combs twice in quick succession. And well, surprise, surprise, that controls AFB. And the question was, did it actually do anything for varroa control? And when the scientific experiments were done on this, it was not supported. So does cell size really matter to the bees? I don't think it's finally solved, as I suggest. I keep an open mind on this. If the evidence comes up that bees are better with small cells, or to build cells exactly as they want to build them. If there are any advantages in that, I would keep an open mind. So dispersion of colonies, the natural density of colonies is said to be about one colony per square kilometre. This is what Seeley found in the forest. Other studies show greater or lesser densities, and they're in different habitats. And what probably underlies these differences is the ability to find good nest sites. And if there are a lot of good nest sites, then the next limiting factor may be the availability of forage. If there are too many bees in an area and they can't get enough forage, they haven't got a nice beekeeper to come and feed them for the winter, then that will also limit the density of nest sites. So the natural tendency is for swarms to disperse. And I say the ideal, various figures are given, but they like to move. Some bees actually have been shown to like to move up to 1/2 mile. So does keeping bees in apiaries matter? This is the opposite to isolation, of course. Is the degree of isolation significant? Well, it is, because this is a case of, in an apiary, you can have horizontal transmission of disease, whereas when the colonies are well spaced out, you can virtually only have vertical transmission within the colony. And this has important implications for natural selection and the pathogenicity of disease organisms, because if you've got horizontal transmission available to you in an apiary, if you kill the colony, your host colony, then you can move on to another colony. But if you're well spaced out and there's only vertical transmission, the natural selection is to curb your activity so that you don't actually kill your host. So it does change the pathway of natural selection. So in the past, Les Bailey, the pathologist at Rothamsted, after the Second World War, apparently there was a very high density of apiaries in the country, and he reckoned this was caused an increased level of disease due to this sort of effect. So There is good evidence that spacing of colony is a problem, but the question is what we can do. What can we do about it? We neither have the land available in this country, nor do we want to go a quarter of a mile between our hives or something like that. We have to. I think we have to live with the real world on this one, but it's as well to recognise there is a difference. Right, so these are the major management issues for management, and that is the colony size. Does the size of the colony really matter? What we do in swarm control, and then finally the use of a queen excluder. How do these management practices affect the bees? Colony size probably doesn't matter. It's not obvious that it has any impact on disease, but it does on varroa. And of course, when we manage the colony size, we're actually entering a catch-22 situation, because the larger the colony, the more likely it is to swarm. The only other impact of producing large colonies is it will almost inevitably shorten the working life of a queen, because she will produce more brood and she will run out of sperm earlier, but it's not an issue, major issue. How does swarm control affect the colony? Oh, good preemptive swarm control leads to late season swarming. If you get it right, you can prevent the colony swarming for most of the season, and it happens late in the season, probably 2 months later than it naturally would. And then if the colony is actually allowed to swarm, that swarm has a significantly reduced chance of success because of the limited time it has to get established in a new nest and accumulate enough stores to get through the winter. So that this in the absence of beekeeper, or a beekeeper allowing it to swarm, this is not good. Artificial swarming does give a colony a potential new queen, and we can make use of that. So most requeening is done through swarming, and the beekeeper needs to take this into account. But a lot of beekeeping, particularly preventing caste swarming, requires the beekeeper to thin queen cells. This means that you are making the choice of the new queen, not the bees themselves. And this is something we try to avoid. We don't want to play God in this. Colonies make surplus queen cells, and they didn't tell us why, but there's a lot of complex behavior involved in choosing a new queen. And this is behavior that we don't understand, but my view is that the bees know best, so it's much better to allow the colony to choose a queen for itself. And there are variations on management which allow them to do this. So the queen excluder, we've never kept bees without a queen excluder, and we haven't ever forgotten to put one on. But the queen does lay very differently in a colony without a queen excluder. She tends to lay in a spire up the middle of the hive, right the way through the honey supers. This is its natural behavior, and is this important? Well, it is part of hygienic behavior, because she tends to lay more on new comb than if she is confined to a brood area by a queen excluder. So it probably is important, but beekeepers can mitigate this effect of using a queen excluder. I'm not suggesting that people abandon queen excluder, but hygiene is important, because old combs harbour disease, AFB and EFB. Also, new combs induce the queen to lay more brood. So more bees means more honey, so it's a bargain. So the solution to this, and this is what you'll be told all the time anyway, and most of us, I hope, do, the solution is to renew your brood combs on a regular basis. and a 3-year cycle is usually suggested. So that means the beekeeper should aim to replace 3 to 4 brood combs each year in the brood area. So natural sustainable beekeeping, I'm not actually promoting natural beekeeping because a lot of it is just based on some fairly daft ideas about allowing colonists to do exactly what they want to do and not restricting them. And we can learn a lot from the way bees live in the wild, but we do not have to turn the clock back 150 years and use pre-Langstroth hives to achieve this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a movable frame modular hive that we now use, and it's how we use it that matters really. Okay, bee health. Evolution of honeybee started about 100 million years ago, and something very like our honeybee was around 30 million years ago. They found fossilized comb, which suggests that this was occupied by a colonial insect. But what was the most important step in this evolution of the honeybee? So arguably, it was evolving the means to control disease organisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites. And without this in place, there is really no way forward. So the honeybees do not and cannot practice social distancing. It's as simple as that. The colonial lifestyle, living closely packed together, favors disease transmission. And a bee is in close bodily contact with other bees for 95% of its life. For most other animals and plants, space between individual population density is a major factor in limiting disease transmission. But for bees, population density only appears to operate at a colony level. It's only important if there are a lot of colonies in one area, not the spacing inside the colony. How has the bee solved its colony disease problems? Well, by a whole range of hygienic behaviours, removal of all waste material, and particularly dead bees, larvae and pupae. And there are dedicated mortician bees in colonies whose sole role is to see that things remain clean and hygienic. Comb usage and replacement of the comb is important. As I've already said, the use of propolis coating the nest cavity may also be very important and something we don't normally avail ourselves of as beekeepers. And I say, low density dispersion of colonies is important. And the bees, individual bees' immune system has now found to be much more complex than it was originally thought to be. And there is a very real possibility that there is actually a colony level immune system. And this means a system in which information about pathogens is communicated. In other words, a sort of vaccination program. We already know that beneficial organisms, gut flora and fauna, are passed on by the nurse bees to the larvae in the brood nest. So they emerge with a favorable microbiome in their guts. Could other immunity primers pass this way? We don't know exactly what is going on during trophallaxis, but this is another route by which a form of vaccination could take place. And it is certain, in evolutionary terms, it would make sense if there was such an immune system, and this would make it the complete superorganism, if you like. We would have a whole body immune system apart from for the individual bee. Intercolony genetic diversity, the Queen's extravagant and risky mating behaviour has risen through natural selection So the fact that it takes these risks must be adaptive, otherwise it wouldn't be done that way. The semen supplied by one drone is enough to fill a queen spermatheca. So when she mates between 10 and 20 drones, most of that semen that she receives goes to waste, while she takes samples of each drone's contribution to give the colony diversity. And the number of drone partners is far in excess of what is required to minimize the duplication of sex alleles. Those of you who understand about diploid drones and so on will understand that remark. Some people may not. So now genetic diversity is known to be vital to all aspects of colony function. Those include disease resistance. But we don't know fully how it works, but it does suggest we ought to be very careful about closed population breeding of bees. So what should be our expectation of honeybee? Because the honeybee is essentially a wild animal, we should actually expect it to have inherent resistance to endemic diseases, and beekeepers should strive to maintain this status. In the wild, this is done by natural selection. Colonies with low resistance do not survive, but we beekeepers tend to suspend natural selection and keep our colonies alive at all costs. I think it's very important to recognize the genetic influence of feral colonies. These have been subject to natural selection, which may be very important. On Anglesey, we have had feral colonies throughout the whole business of Roa. And I'm not sure they even were very much reduced at any time. And we are starting to make very good use of these colonies. I'm not going to go into that now, but these colonies have abilities that other colonies don't. So beekeepers use, and they use of medications, encountering disease. The natural reaction of many beekeepers is to turn to medication. And the worst possible scenario is when medications are used prophylactically, as has been used in the past in this country with Fumidol B. A lot of I knew beekeepers in the southeast of England who regularly put Fumidol B in their feed to prevent them getting nosema. Nobody ever seems to have done this at Anglesey, and we never seem to, as far as we're aware, we don't have problems in nosema because natural selection has dealt with them. In America, of course, antibiotics were used to control American foul brood. Of course, this is a dead-end activity. The use of medications is never sustainable because virtually all of them, the target organism gains resistance to them sooner or later. They're only a temporary solution. One of the, I think, very wise sayings by Beowulf Cooper, the founder of Bibber, was, his remark was, winter losses are an asset. So culling or requeening colonies. Culling on healthy colonies is good. Requeening is another option, but it's not always the best option. There is evidence that some colonies are more resistant to disease than others. Say we have nosema. We think we've got colonies that are more resistant to deformed ring virus, for example. Difficult to prove. The policy of compulsory destruction of colonies with AFB is good because this is a form of enhanced natural selection, if you like. And I think it is, my view, it's open to question whether we don't adopt the same policy with EFB, because this is the notifiable bee disease that really hasn't shown any significant decrease over many years. And I think saving these colonies, okay, it's now done by swarming rather than antibiotics. I think this has probably not been the best long-term policy. And culling colonies, I don't think ethical considerations really apply for this. Some people might think they do. Of course, Varroa is our real problem. Apis mellifera has not evolved with this parasite. They're unlike any of our endemic diseases because they have no natural resistance. And worse still, Varroa has upset the relationship with endemic diseases, in particular deformed wing virus. So unfortunately, by treating to control Varroa, we are largely suspending natural selection. And you may ask what alternatives we have. Well, some of you will have read Stephen Martin's booklet produced by BBK News on this subject, and you may want to think about that. Threats to the honeybee, there are lots of those still available. Propylaelaps, small hive beetle. Asian horn, it's not really a beekeeping problem. We can't influence that one way or the other. It'll just be a pest if it comes established, but we're not going to be, that's one thing we're not going to be responsible for. Nosema serrani seems to actually have found its own level. It was greatly feared when it was first detected in this country, but it doesn't seem to have done anything very much. And there are new strains and species of virus available to be introduced. And of course, the basic problem is globalization. And this has been developed for a long time, but the speed and volume is increasing. I mean, the first major example resulting in Varroa started back in the 1800s when we took honeybees out to the Far East when they came in contact with Apis cerana. So the jumbo jet syndrome is that anything can be anywhere in the world in only 24 hours. I wrote this before the current situation, so it creates the possibility, likelihood of a pandemic disease for us humans, and the same applies to bees. I didn't change that, didn't see any point. With all this fast movement, there's no time to slow things down, and there's no time for control measures to be put in place. After World War I, there was this worldwide pandemic of flu, and it came back a second time, but natural selection had made it much more benign, and it didn't kill people in anything like the same numbers on its second round. What can beekeepers do in relation to all this? We can stop importing bees, and particularly queens, from around the world. And trade regulations are not going to come to our aid. The government's not going to stop free trade unless we can mount a very, very good reason for doing so. So the solution is really in our own hands to reduce or eliminate demand for queens and in particular for colonies and bee packages, and to become nationally self-sufficient for bees. And hobby beekeepers could achieve this. It's very easy to learn the skills of simple methods of making increase and provide yourself. And we've done it for 30 years, and we've now trained a lot of beekeepers in our association to do it. And we're not bringing other bees from anywhere else onto the island, and we're very happy about that because we actually have the best record of notifiable disease outbreaks in, I think, the whole country. Probably we haven't had American foul brood on the island for 45 years, and we've had just one incident of European foul brood about 25 years ago, And that was a colony that had just been brought onto the island from England. It wasn't a local colony at all. Commercial beekeepers got more of a problem. They rely for pollination contracts and things. They do rely on these things, but that is a culture that could be changed, and I think ought to be. Just the final 2 slides now, you'll be happy to know. The avoidance of more extreme forms of bee breeding. Intracolony genetic diversity is known to be essential in all aspects of colony function. Of these diseases, it is probably the most important. And it follows that anything that reduces genetic diversity should really be avoided like the plague. So, I mean, if any of you are bee breeders, some of your activities, I think, are not in the best long-term interest of the honeybee. And I'm going to leave the final word on this subject to Leslie Bailey, the bee pathologist. And he wrote an article for Bee World back in 1999, and this is the abstract. This is the beginning of the paper. I'll just read it out to you. Highly intensive selection of honeybee for any quality may decrease its resistance to a wide variety of enzootic pathogens, that means diseases, by decreasing its genetic variability. Maintenance of naturally adapted regional strains by traditional means and management that least inhibits their essentially independent lifestyle may be more rewarding. That's what he had to say. So I think Leslie Bailey's advice takes us full circle back to the title of this talk. Unless we are absolutely sure we know what we're doing as beekeepers, we should always assume that the bees know best. Thank you for listening. Ooh, where am I now? Stop sharing. Where have I gone?
Well, thank you. What a fascinating presentation.
So it went on a bit. Let me just stop sharing now. Where am I now? Where's my stop sharing?
Well, thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation, Wally. Many thanks indeed. Perhaps we can all show our appreciation by with a silent clap. I'll now read out the questions raised on the chat button. I saw some popping up, and I'll try and get them into a logical sequence. Graham's raised a couple here, following on from the Tom Seeley presentation, and Tom was recommending that old combs should be kept, which I know runs against most of the teaching we have. And then he follows that up with saying comb size is reduced over time, you know, but just because of the cocoons in there. So, what do you think of that fact, Wally?
I've heard that Tom said that, and I must admit I've never asked him why, because I've not understood it. And yes, the cell size does decrease with time as the cells accumulate pupal skins, but this is more a function of keeping bees in hive with these nice wooden frames and reinforcing and so on. I don't think it happens nearly to the same extent in wild bees' nests, where a wild bee colony, the average life of a wild bee colony when it's been measured has been about 5 or 6 years before there's a hiatus and the nest site falls out of use. In which time what is really our friend, the wax moth, comes along and destroys it all, so they can start from scratch again. So I don't know why Tom said that. I really don't. I will ask him sometime.
Okay, I think we all had the similar reaction. Then the next question we've got is, do you know if your bees on Anglesey travel across water to mate, travel across to the mainland to mate?
No, we don't. We don't know. it is. I've heard it claimed that bees do not like to cross water because of light polarization from the water surface. We know bees can see light polarization, but on the other hand, I've heard stories of yachts at sea having swarms settle on their rigging, which totally contradicts that. I don't know whether we do or we don't. Certainly, some of these offshore islands in Denmark are used for bee breeding, and it is reckoned they have to be several miles offshore for them to be absolutely secure about not getting drones in from elsewhere. But I don't know I have no idea what sort of figure it limits them.
Okay. Is there anyone else got any further questions, please? Because that's the questions I've got on the chat page. So if anyone else got a question, please can you unmute and ask your question? But it looks like Beth Hawkes is raising her hand.
Hello. Hi, Wally.
Hello.
Thank you for your lovely presentation. It was great. It's interesting, actually. You were saying about encouraging genetic diversity. So I'm a relatively new beekeeper, and we've got 3 hives, and a couple of them we think that probably we'll raise a couple of new queens this year. Obviously, if you're a small beekeeper and you keep raising queens to replace from your new colony, it might happen anyway if they swarm, swarm prevention. But is it therefore better to be talking to other beekeepers in Devon and actually swapping queen bees rather than keep producing yourself with your own stock?
I often hear this argument about loss of genetic diversity, and really the only case where I think you could be in problem with genetic diversity if you do not live within reasonable range of other beekeepers or places where there are feral bee colonies. Okay. Because queen bees really go out of their way to mix it. Okay. We do observe 1 or 2 rules. We, in our own apiaries, which we do quite a lot of queen mating in, we refrain as far as possible from keeping daughters of the same queen in that apiary. We like to keep the maximum number of lines in that apiary. There's some evidence, particularly in rather unfavorable windy climates like ours, that if the weather is not suitable, honeybee queens will mate quite locally. They won't go very far. So we think it's quite important to maintain the genetic diversity in our apiaries to cover this eventuality. And of course, you have to remember that if you've got sources of drones in the area, drones are quite free to join a colony from elsewhere. They can quite happily get bed and breakfast from a colony that they're allowed in. And I've not actually seen a study to show the proportion of drones that are in colonies that didn't actually originate in this colony, but in some cases they're quite high. We make a lot of nukes, and they start off, usually as they're made up, there's possibly 1 or 2 drones in them, and there may be a bit of drone brood. But we notice as soon as they got a virgin queen, they miraculously suddenly have a lot of drones in them. Cherchez la femme, so to speak.
Not like men, is it?
No, not at all. No, we behave much better than that. So that we did have a beekeeper on our in our area here who lived up in the mountains in quite an isolated place. And it was absolutely evident that he could not get queens mated there. He had to move his apiary to a lower altitude where there were more colonies available. It's an area where there were no other beekeepers, and I don't think any possibility of feral colonies, and it just didn't work. So that would be a problem. But I mean, a lot of bee breeders seek just that problem. They want to go to an isolated place, and they want to put in colonies of their choice to produce the drones, because they actually want to narrow the genetic variation which the bees can mate. And this seems to me a completely stupid exercise, considering that the breeding strategy of the queen is to maximize diversity. It's even more than that, because when the queen makes eggs, her cells have to go from a diploid to a haploid condition. And this is a process, if you've done you're listening at biology at school, it's called meiosis, right? And meiosis is done when the double-stranded DNA pulls apart, right? But as it pulls apart, various lengths of it stick, and there are what called crossovers, right? So no two gametes, sperm or eggs or whatever, exactly the same, because there are always these crossovers present. But the bee, in meiosis, the bee has 20 times the level of crossovers that we humans have when we make gametes, right? And that just shows you again how natural selection has aimed again at diversity, diversity, diversity.
I've got a question now. Sorry, Beth, have you finished? Have you finished?
Yes, I have. Yeah, thank you, Wally.
Sorry.
Okay.
I've got a different question on a different topic now, and it's saying here, also, as well as propolis, do you know if there are natural plants that help encourage good health?
No, I don't know. In terms of propolis, yes. Some propolis is, if you look at the work of Marla Spivak, you will find that she and some other co-workers have looked at different forms of propolis. And in one of her experiments, she deliberately gets chalk brood larvae and powders them and sprinkles the powder in a hive, right? And those bees immediately respond by going out and collecting propolis. And their favorite propolis that they collect to deal with this problem is from a species of poplar. So poplar propolis appears to be very active. And there are several other ones. There's a huge literature on the use of propolis for human medicine, which I don't know how good some of it is, but there are big differences. It's generally, it's something we, I think, neglect. As I say, we're going to have a go at producing dummy boards with a surface that we use dummy boards quite a bit anyway, and particularly in the training apiary, because it makes opening hives easier, because you can take the first frame out usually very easily without disturbing anything. If you provide we're looking to provide a dummy board that has a surface which attracts the bees to deposit propolis on it. And it's not known whether propolis is active as by contact or by the vapor it emits, but it's probably both. And its active life is not much more than a year. It really needs to be renewed. And this is something we could do quite easily by just putting in fresh boards each year to attract propolis. And it may or may not be something useful. We're looking to investigate it anyway.
That sounds like an interesting experiment. Got another question now. Do you recommend using smaller comb and allowing the bees to fill the bottom in as required to choose drone or worker comb as needed?
We've done this, yes, we've done this. And it's another thing that I would like to explore. I would like to see exactly. I don't know whether you've seen these designs of comb where you use a strip of wood at the top of them to provide a foundation for comb making, and then a couple of vertical sticks. People use barbecue skewers vertically as well, and you can make a comb that is sort of semi-reinforced this way. And I've got some of these made, and we're going to use them this year. But we have just done it with a strip of a foundation at the top, just a little curtain at the top, just to start them off.
Yes, I've seen that. Now I've got a question from Paul. What do you use on the dummy boards to promote propolis creation?
I am going to put, it's like a plastic, it's like an expanded mesh, but in plastic.
Oh, okay.
And rather foolishly, I will admit, rather foolishly, we made some of these frames by actually stapling this mesh onto an empty frame, right? But it's quite a difficult thing to do, and it leaves small gaps. And what we found was the blessed bees found their way inside this thing and couldn't get out again. But they did start to deposit propolis on them. But it was a design fault, shall we say, in doing it. It does attract propolis, though, in the same way that, you know, you have ventilation mesh anywhere in your hive, it very quickly becomes filled up with propolis.
Okay, and Gareth has thrown in a comment here. If you want propolis, Carpathian queens make it for a pastime, which I think sounds like a bit of personal experience.
Yes, they have this reputation of doing this, but I mean, we keep what is basically Apis mellifera mellifera, and we've had, in the past, we've had all the different races on the island, I suspect, although we've had relatively few introductions in recent years. And I'm sure we have got genes from all sorts of races in our bees. And we don't take the bibber attitude that we want to breed back to a pure Apis mellifera mellifera, for the simple reason that evolution proceeds in this sort of way. Species get isolated by geography or climate, and they meet up again and they exchange genes, and genes that are useful, adaptive to them, they will retain. Other ones will be eliminated by natural selection. I mean, it is now known that our own species is actually a hybrid. We contain genes from several other now extinct hominid species, of which Neanderthal man is quite important. We owe quite an important part of our immune system is derived from genes in Neanderthal man. So we obviously went about a bit as hominids and mixed it up a bit, you know, did our own gathering of genetic diversity.
Okay. Well, we've had a huge amount of your time, Wally. I'm most grateful. We've gone on for far longer than normal.
That's all right. No.
Perhaps we can all say thank you in the usual way. Just a couple of repeats for people. So Wally's most recent book is called Swarming, Biology and Control, and is available from Beecraft.
We're clapping.
For those of you who'd like to read Wally's beekeeping papers in more detail, They're available free from the Welsh Beekeepers Association website, but I will be putting links on those onto the Exeter website. For others who probably haven't seen it yet, you may be interested to know that the Exeter Beekeepers have recently invested in refreshing the association's website. And I plan to keep that up to date with the latest news to complement Kathy's emails. So please have a look at the new website and you'll find the links for the different presentations on there. The website's called exeterbeekeepers.org.uk. And as I say, Wally's presentation will be uploaded onto the website, as well as the links to Wally's booklets. So I think that's about it as far as I can see. Any questions from anyone? Thank you very much indeed, Wally.